It's June 22nd, 2021, and this video is about the sub minimum wage, also known as the tipped minimum wage. And it's also just about America and the voting public and our talking heads' complete lack of ability to focus, like we have collective political ADHD in this country. So, like, here's political psychology lesson for y'all. Um, Bernie Sanders has done some things that Jimmy Dore has been right to criticize. And I voted for Bernie Sanders in 2016 in the primary, and I couldn't bring myself to vote for him in 2020. I voted for Yang several days after Yang dropped out because Yang was the only person still almost in the race that I still liked enough to vote for. I don't support him over his recent strongly pro Israel stance that he's turned out to have, but I like the UBI. So I appreciate that Jimmy Dore has criticized Bernie Sanders. And here's an article that came out March 12th, 2020 from the Cato Institute. It's called Bernie Sanders is a Foreign Policy Disappointment. You can read that article, and you can read my article on agrarian.blogspot.com. Bernie Sanders, something like a Bernie Sanders foreign policy. I'll link it in the description. Bernie Sanders' domestic policy hides his abysmal foreign policy. And I figured out that there's 40 examples of times that Bernie Sanders either supported a war in the Middle East or Africa that perhaps wasn't appropriate to support, usually in concert with Biden's vote on the matter, by the way. And also, times he watered down attempts to audit the Federal Reserve, stuff like that. So I've criticized Bernie Sanders, but in this video, I'm going to praise Bernie Sanders for one thing, but it's a very important thing in relation to Jimmy Dore's debates about Medicare for All and forcing the vote. But I just want to say, lastly, you could criticize me as a libertarian, and you'd be right, but like I'm in the Socialist Caucus in the Libertarian Party, and I also hang out with Greens. And I try to get the Green support. Like I support third parties working together. I'm not just a libertarian. The Greens and Libertarians, they both, and voluntary socialists, they all support decentralization and voluntarism, consent of the governed. We have those things in common. We can work together. And you could say I'm a right winger for citing the Cato Institute, but you could also look at it this way. How bad are you at foreign policy, Bernie Sanders, when the people at the Cato Institute can dunk on you? The author of the article, by the way, is Ted Galen Carpenter. I've never heard of him, so to be honest, I haven't even read the article. I wrote my own article on the matter, link in the description. But this video is supposed to be mostly on the sub minimum wage or the tipped wage. And basically, there's a several problems with, I keep talking like an Italian that I am. There's a several problems with the minimum wage. And Bernie Sanders was bringing this up. Now, there are all these people who had their own, in Congress, who had their own idea about how to pass or propose a minimum wage. Bernie Sanders said in, I think, March that he had a plan to propose a minimum wage increase to $15 and also another step, but like he didn't specify what that step was. And basically, just the problem is that Bernie Sanders' solution, like the way he would implement a minimum wage increase to $15, it wasn't well publicized enough. There wasn't enough attention around it because not enough people are familiar with the tipped wage and the sub minimum wage. Some people are familiar with the fact that Kansas and other states, Kansas has the lowest minimum wage, and people who might get tipped, and this affects a lot of states, not just Kansas. People who might get tipped or thought that, oh, they'll probably make more than a minimum wage. We don't have to enforce that. So Bernie Sanders is calling attention to the sub minimum wage and the need to have increased the minimum wage to $15. He's saying that needs to include people who get tips. We need to actually legally make sure that they'll make that as part of their negotiated pay because they might not get tipped. Can't just assume that people are getting tipped. And Bernie Sanders brought up that very important issue. Now, like I said, he has a lot of foreign policy faults. He voted with Joe Biden way too many times to really be forgiven at this point, almost. Like, he voted for the 94 crime bill. You could say that he invoked racism to make people afraid of O.J. Simpson, to cite Nicole Brown Simpson's death to say that we need to pass Bernie Sanders' Violence Against Women Act in concert with the 94 crime bill, which arguably put 1 million black men into prison slavery, modern day slavery, for nonviolent drug crimes mostly. So that was a very bad vote that Bernie made on crime and on foreign policy. But I'm glad that he brought up this very important thing to raise the minimum wage for tipped workers and people below the minimum wage, but not at a level that the law can actually do anything about it. Because if you look it up, the federal government simultaneously makes two contradictory claims. One is that anyone and everyone who uses federal government services, which is all businesses, because most all businesses have phones, which the federal government provides, they use the roads, so they must fall under federal jurisdiction. That means they're magically guaranteed to be subject to federal government minimum wage laws. And that means they're going to get it right. Hang on. The other half of that claim, it's also that you don't qualify for it because the federal government wants you to think that state laws don't override that. And legally, constitutionally, they do. Like pending a Supreme Court decision that's specific on the matter, they do override that. There is no authority for federal government minimum wage laws outside of minimum wage laws that apply to the federal workers that are working for the government under legitimate constitutional purposes, like military, mail, and money, treasury. Those are the basic things that the government does and is supposed to do. And beyond that is, oh, we got to pay for federal health workers. We got to pay for 9/11 first responders. We got to pay for this and that. All these armed bureaucrats that we forget they're armed, and there's 100,000 of them. So just remember, they did pass a minimum wage increase to $15 an hour earlier this year in January or February, and I predicted it. You don't remember that? That's because it only applied to less than 1% of American workers and applied to only less than 1% of non-tipped workers. It applied to the lowest paid federal government workers. The lowest paid federal government workers are the only people whose wages got raised in that minimum wage raise to $15, which occurred earlier this year, that you might not have heard of because it was a big disappointment. Jimmy Dore talked about it with Ron Falcone. I made a video talking about how I predicted it because I understand how the law works. But people are so resentful of the fact that privilege allows some people to have education about constitutional law, such that they choose to shout people down and whine and cry like babies while sitting down in the floor of Congress, spying, like illegally broadcasting from the congressional chamber, while demanding to vote away the rights of people to defend themselves that founded this country, without which you can't exercise your right to demand legitimate government. So basically, our institutions are being degraded by a lot of sources, but one we don't think about is just people who are really funny and do podcasts and make a lot of great points, who don't really understand the Constitution or economics or history as well as they like to think they are, that they do, like Jimmy Dore, Kyle Kalinske, Sam Sater, the Hound. Yeah. So you actually have to study Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and that is the part that tells you which parts of the federal government are legitimate. And if you don't see it there, it was added on later. That's not to say you can't have the federal government do more things. You're supposed to do that through the amendment process, the process of constitutional amendment, amending the Constitution constitutionally to make the federal government, have permanent reforms that you want so that they're not temporary and can't be tampered with by fleeting changes of majorities or minorities, or wrecked by governors, or struck down by the Supreme Court. Like, do you want to spend years and years of effort and trillions of dollars trying to pass a law that's not ever going to be legally implemented? One of my first campaign ads is about this. I'm talking about Obamacare. Those and these wars, they were trillions of dollars. Those were never constitutional, but the government and Stephen Colbert have got you convinced that government's a force for good and has been a force for good ever once. Really? I could win. We So stop buying this shit. Stop buying the idea that the government's good. If you want to try to work with the government and maintain the idea the government's good and try reform, please have one step in either anarchy or activism or some kind of humanitarian work, or at least do your job well and unionize it. Do something. Do some community gardens. Um, just remember that these people who do podcasts, they might be funny, but doesn't mean they know everything. And if they put more energy into trying to make you laugh, that's great because they're trying to entertain you. But some of them might be trying to put one over on you. Like I said, these people who try to be politicians or activists at the same time as they're comedians, sometimes they're like chameleons. They can pass off whatever they say as a joke, and basically the problem is that Jimmy Dore and Anna Kasperi and like all this stuff, it's like it's devolved into it's they're no longer talking about why the attempt to pass the minimum wage failed. It was because like okay, so they're talking about how they didn't attach it to the rescue plan, but like the real issue here is that Bernie Sanders had a legitimate point. It's just that he had done so much shit in his past that no one wanted to listen to him anymore. It's like okay, you voted with Joe Biden on the crime bill, and I talk about this, and the Cato Institute talk about this, but not a lot of other people do. You voted for all these wars in the Middle East and Africa, Bernie. Like I said, I couldn't vote for him by the time 2020 came around. I'm not voting for him again. Um, but we need to learn from this. We need to find someone else better. If you want to increase the minimum wage to $15, you need to make sure it includes everyone, and you need to take Bernie's advice on that and include people who are tipped, hypothetically tipped. Those people who wait on you and bring you your food and who have just had to, I hope, and in most cases, go through some training to deliver your food in a healthy way. So Jimmy Dore has made a lot of great points. Bernie Sanders has made a good point on the minimum wage, but Jimmy Dore has failed to notice. And as far as I'm aware, Sam Cedar and Cal Kalinske and other people have failed to notice that Bernie Sanders, his cause was just there. And we need to educate ourselves on why the minimum wage doesn't apply to all people for the reasons that I've mentioned before we go saying, oh, the next minimum wage, the next attempt to raise it is just going to succeed and it's going to help everyone. It's like, did you read the bill?